Salah ad-Din, the man, not quite a myth, and far more than just a legend. I know what you're thinking. Another video on Salah ad-Din? What could be possibly said about him that hasn't already been said? Books, lectures, documentaries, you name it, have all tried to capture the essence of this towering figure. It feels like everyone and their dad has something to say about Salah ad-Din. Friend or foe, Muslim or Christian, scholars and poets alike have been drawn to his legacy. For over 800 years, from Ibn Shaddad to William of Tyre, from Dante to Voltaire, the spotlight has followed this man for one overwhelming reason: the liberation of Jerusalem. Yes, a remarkable feat, a moment in history that's been bookmarked with reverence, especially by Muslims across time and place. But if I'm going to be honest, I think Muslims focus too much on Salah ad-Din conquering Jerusalem. Wait, don't click off, hear me out. Do I think it was important? Absolutely, no doubt, 100%. But was it the most significant part of Salah ad-Din's life? Not really. And I want to explain how and why we've been missing the bigger picture. I want to dig deeper and find out what lay beneath the greatness of Salah ad-Din. So for that, I'm going to pull back the curtain and explore this genius. His discipline in moments when lesser men would have folded. And more than that, we need to recognize that the liberation of Jerusalem wasn't just about him. So no, this video isn't a biography, it's a study. A journey in the mind, heart and soul of a man who reshaped the world. And we'll end with answering one powerful question. Was Salah ad-Din great because he liberated Jerusalem? Or was he able to liberate Jerusalem because he was great? By the end of this video, you will know the answer. Let's begin. Like I said, this is definitely not a biography, but a study plunging into the world before and during Salah ad-Din's time. Rewinding the clock and looking back at the warrior king is not enough. We must look at the shoulders on which he stood on, the giants that not only made him, but the army that he marched with. That's where we begin. Then we'll look at the man himself. Not just the general in shining armor, but Salah ad-Din who stood barefoot in prayer, who stayed up at night with the wounded, who gave away more than he kept. Next, we'll meet the people who stood beside him, advisors who whispered hard truths, soldiers who followed him through winter marches, brothers who disagreed and still stuck. And finally, we'll walk with him in his final years, as the weight of kingship pressed heavier, as the victories grew quieter, as death came not with a sword, but a sigh. If we want to understand how Salah ad-Din took back Jerusalem after nearly a century, and more than that, how he didn't lose it when the world came crashing down around him, then we have to look deeper than just what he did. We need to see who he was and who made him that way. To understand Salah ad-Din's rise, we first need to step into the world he was born into. And if you think the 21st century is fractured, just wait until you meet the 12th century Islamic world. It was a tangle of feuding sultans, rogue emirs and self-proclaimed warlords carving up land like spoiled sons dividing an inheritance. There was no order, only ambition. No unity, only claim and counterclaim. In short, it was a broken mess. Down on the streets, things weren't any better. The Abbasid realm was crawling with theological factions, schools of thought, and sects that could not bear to walk on the same footpaths, much less have a spirited debate over chai. Theological disputes spilled out of lecture halls and into the alleys of Baghdad. Fists did the talking and knives finished sentences. There was one record of a Hanafi scholar once saying, "If I had the authority, I'd make the Shafi'is pay the jizya." Yeah, that bad. The last Islamic superpower, the Abbasids, are a shadow of their former glory. By the mid-10th century, its political machinery had collapsed. Provincial governors stopped pretending to be loyal servants and began carving out their own kingdoms. Dynasties rose overnight. Power passed from father to son, not from caliph to court. The caliph, once the shadow beneath whose banner armies marched, was now just that, a shadow. In 945, that shadow all but disappeared. A Shia clan known as Buyuds marched into Baghdad and seized control. They handed the Sunni caliph a humiliating pension, stripped him of any authority beyond the walls of his own house, and rubbed salt in the wound by stamping their own names on coins and weaving them into Friday sermons. Baghdad, once the beating heart of the Muslim world, split into two, Sunni and Shia quarters, separated not just by creed, but by steel. But the real threat to Sunni power lay west in Egypt. The Ismaili Shia Fatimid dynasty had risen with confidence and clarity. From North Africa to Palestine, their banners flew high, sharp and disciplined and unmistakably bold. The Fatimids weren't just powerful, they were persuasive. Their influence spread like ink on parchment, soaking through the fabric of the region. At first, the Sunni response came with clenched fists and raised voices. The Abbasid Caliph, a committed Hanbali, threw his weight behind hardline scholars and street preachers who fought the Shia presence. Hanbali groups, particularly in Baghdad, took to the streets not with arguments but with iron rods. They stormed rival gatherings, they tore down banners, they silenced dissent not through debate but through brute force. Some of these quarters came to be feared more than respected, known less for scholarship than for fanaticism. It was a reaction, not a solution. Unsustainable, narrow, exhausting. Sunni Islam was fragmenting under the pressure, not just from without, but from within. And it became painfully clear, if the Sunni world was to survive, it couldn't just fight its threats. It had to outgrow it. This revival did not rise out of thin air. It was carved into the world by two towering figures. The first was Nizam al-Mulk, the brilliant Persian vizier who served the Seljuk sultans with unmatched cunning and vision. The second was Imam al-Ghazali, the proof of Islam whose pen shaped hearts more sharply than swords ever could. Among many voices of the age, these two stood tallest. Together they became the architects of new Sunnism, Nizam al-Mulk as its political brain and Ghazali as its spiritual soul. Their legacy took physical form in the Nizamiya College, a revolutionary institution at the heart of Baghdad. Here, governance met the Islamic sciences. Law shared space with theology, spirituality was not a footnote but a foundation. Students were not trained merely to argue but to lead, to judge and to refine themselves. From the lecture halls of the Nizamiya, a new Sunni orthodoxy emerged, one that was tolerant, moderate and inclusive of all mainstream Sunni strands and schools of thoughts. In many ways, Salah ad-Din was Nizam al-Mulk's heir. His policies, his appointments, his vision of unity all echoed the great Seljuk minister. As for al-Ghazali, his influence ran quieter but no less deep. The novelist Percy Newby once remarked that Salah ad-Din would have been far more of a fundamentalist had it not been for Ghazali. With the groundwork of Sunni unity firmly laid by scholars like Nizam al-Mulk and Imam al-Ghazali, the revival now had both the width and depth. For Nizam al-Mulk, inclusivity was a matter of political survival, a broad orthodoxy that could unify desperate strands of Sunni thought under a single banner. For al-Ghazali, depth was a spiritual imperative, an inner revival that reached the soul of the believer, purging doubt, hollow ritualism, and the excesses of rationalism alike. These ideas did not remain confined to ink and parchment. They rode the winds of history, drifting westward and took root a century later in the cities of Syria. There they blossomed into madrasas, but they were no ordinary schools. They were the blueprints of a new political theology. Madrasas were not only centers of legal instruction, they were factories of loyalty, designed to produce a new breed of bureaucrat, one trained in Islamic law, steeped in orthodoxy, and loyal to Sunni rule. Slowly, the old class of arrogant secretaries, those indifferent to religion, fluent only in power, began to vanish. In their place rose a new secretarial elite, jurists, judges, theologians trained not just to serve the state, but to shape it. The madrasa transformed the very nature of the ulama. No longer outsiders to the palace gates, they became part of the machinery itself. Scholars in robes, but also statesmen in spirit. So what's the link between the Nizamiya in Baghdad and Salah ad-Din in Egypt and Syria 75 years later? That honor belongs to none other than Nur ad-Din Zinki. It was Nur ad-Din who took the thought of the revival and gave it breadth and body in the very lands where Salah ad-Din would come of age. It was he who championed the madrasa as a tool of spiritual and political formation, spreading its roots deep into the soil of Syria. To speak of Salah ad-Din without first invoking his spiritual master, Nur ad-Din, is to miss the essence of the story. Nur ad-Din was a man carved from principle. He wore no silk, no gold, no silver. He walked with humility of a servant, not the swagger of a king. His piety was not performative, it was palpable. He collected hadith with a fervor usually reserved for generals gathering troops, and he paid exorbitant sums to preserve their chains of transmission. And his generosity matched his piety. It was said that he spent 9,000 dinars a month on pious endowments. Before his reign, the Zengid lands held a mere 16 madrasas, that include Syria and Iraq. By the time of his death, 40 had been built. 20 of them commissioned by Nuruddin himself. Crucially, it appeared to matter little to which madhab the madrasa was commissioned. Hanafis built for Shafi'is, Shafi'is built for Hanafis. The bitter rivalries that plagued the eastern provinces of the Abbasid world found no home here. Syria under Nuruddin became a sanctuary of unity, a living vision of the very Sunni revival that had begun a century earlier. And Jerusalem was never far from his thoughts. He held it in his gaze like a fixed star and longed to bring it back into the fold of Islam. So certain was he of its return that he commissioned a mimbar, a pulpit, for Al-Aqsa ready to be installed the moment the city was freed. That mimbar would never see the light of day under Nuruddin, but it would not gather dust either. Salah ad-Din would carry it the rest of the way. It is one thing to prepare a generation for greatness, to train scholars to build madrasas, to stir hearts with sermons and ink the maps of future conquests. This is all noble work, but none of it means anything without a leader who can carry that torch. A leader who could unite feuding emirs, persuade weary bureaucrats, and inspire battle-hardened generals to follow him into the unknown. So the question must be asked, what made Salah ad-Din a great leader? What gave him such pull, such gravity, that even former enemies would one day fight beneath his banner? But before we examine his soul, we must first unlearn the myth. Let's get the misconceptions out of the way. For starters, it cannot be firmly established that Salah ad-Din ever aspired to be a scholar before stepping onto the battlefield. It is fair to say that his piety outpaced his knowledge. He loved the company of scholars and was often drawn to their circles, yes, but the notion that he once dreamed of donning the scholar's robes more than the soldier's armor is at best speculation. In truth, Salah ad-Din's early years remain largely hidden behind a veil of obscurity. Before Egypt, the historical record offers little certainty about the young man at all. And yet, one debate continues to rear its head every now and then. Some claim that Salah ad-Din was not especially devout in his youth, that his piety came later. Even the great Imam al-Dhahabi notes that Salah ad-Din once indulged in wine before turning toward a life of discipline and worship. Is it true? Perhaps, or perhaps not. We will likely never know for sure. Still, I would argue that this debate does not matter. If it is indeed true that Salah ad-Din rose from heedlessness to become the liberator of Al-Aqsa, then this is not a stain upon his record. It is a beacon for the rest of us. For the believer lost in indulgence, Salah ad-Din's story should serve as a great inspiration for change. What we can say with certainty is that Salah ad-Din's character was nothing short of remarkable. He was a staunch Sunni, yes, but not narrow to exclude others from under the umbrella of orthodoxy. Like most Kurds, he was Shafi'i, though in Egypt, he extended favor to the Hanafis and Malikis alike. His inclusivity was not political performance, it was principle. Theologically, he was Ash'ari, though he had little patience for the hair-splitting dogmatic disputation. Public theological debates annoyed him. He found them divisive, prideful, and vain. And at one point, he even considered banning them altogether. Likewise, he had little tolerance for the philosophical speculations that wandered too far afield from Sunni orthodoxy. His convictions were clear as he considered himself a guardian of Sunni tradition. A relevant example of such inclusivity can be seen after his victory in Hattin. When he marched into Jerusalem in victory, who did he choose to ride by his side? None other than Muwaffaq ad-Din ibn Qudama, the towering Hanbali jurist and student of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. Where once Shafi'is and Hanbalis brawled in the alleys of Baghdad, now the Hanbali scholar and the Shafi'i sultan rode together. Indeed, Salah ad-Din loved the scholars and relied on their knowledge heavily. In Egypt, when faced with complex religious matters, Salah ad-Din would often consult the two towering scholars of his day, Silafi, the Shafi'i master, and Ibn Auf, the Maliki jurist. He was no mere patron of scholars, he was their student. A regular presence at Salafi's hadith recitations, Salah ad-Din immersed himself in the words of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, so deep was his love for hadith, he would have hadith recited in the midst of battle. In his later years, when word reached him of his beloved wife's death, he withdrew into seclusion, not with generals or ministers, but with books of hadith. He ordered that the sayings of the Prophet be brought to him to soothe his grief. He was rarely seen praying alone, preferring the humility of the congregation. Ibn Shaddad writes that he was easily moved to tears. When the Quran was recited, he wept openly, unashamed, a sultan with a heart softened by the words of God. Of his family, Salah ad-Din stood astride two pillars, one carved by the diplomatic mind of his father, Ayyub, and the other hardened through battle by his uncle, Shirkuh. Both men shaped him, and both, in their own way, contributed to the Sunni revival. As a young man, Salah ad-Din grew especially close to his uncle, shadowing him through his campaigns. Shirkuh's rough and weathered demeanor, chiseled by years of grit and skirmish, seemed to impress him more than the cool restraint of his father's statesmanship. Yet as the weight of leadership settled on his shoulders, Salah ad-Din began to reveal his true inheritance. He was unmistakably his father's son. What he took from Ayyub above all was caution, a deep, patient caution that marked his every decision. Ibn Shaddad chronicled, "He would ponder and deliberate, exposing each aspect of the situation and taking necessary steps to deal with it, without becoming angry, for he was never irate. Such was his discipline that when news reached him of the death of his young son, he uttered no words. He wept quietly, the tears of a father hidden behind the silence of a sultan." Lastly, no telling of Salah ad-Din's life can pass over his unmatched generosity, his boundless forgiveness, and his gallant nobility. It was these virtues, not merely his victories, that earned him a place in limbo in Dante's Inferno, a place reserved for virtuous non-Christians alongside Socrates and Ibn Rushd. His giving nature was so well known, so unwavering, that those in charge of his treasuries began hiding reserves from him, fearing he might empty them before a true emergency arose. This goes the same for his own personal wealth, all spent on madrasas, mosques, and hospitals. By the time of his death, no less than 30 madrasas stood tall in Damascus alone, each tied to a waqf, an endowment entrusted to fund them for generations. His vision was not short-lived. It bore fruit long after he was laid to rest. Take note, modern Muslims. You couldn't count the stories of Salah ad-Din's mercy and chivalry if you tried. There are too many, and they never seem to run out. Between battles, sieges, and skirmishes, his exceptional character beamed. Take the siege of Acre in 1190 as an example. The Muslims failed to take the city, but did capture a group of Frankish prisoners. Salah ad-Din's young sons urged him to execute them. He refused and released them. He didn't want them to grow up tasting blood. Then there's the story of the Frankish mother. Her baby was stolen during the chaos of war and sold into slavery. The Franks told her to go to Salah ad-Din. He's merciful, they said. She found him weeping and desperate. The Sultan listened. He ordered the market searched. The child was found, brought back, and returned to the mother. Then, he had a horse saddle to carry her safely back to her camp. There are countless others. Prisoners he freed knowing they'd come back to fight him. Horses he sent to wounded enemies like King Richard, including a fruit basket for when he fell sick. Stories that filled the camps passed from soldier to soldier until even his enemies began to wonder if they were fighting a friend or foe. And still, despite it all, Salah ad-Din complained. Not about hardship or defeat, but how tired he was of people constantly begging him for things, always assuming he'd give, because he always did. For all his brilliance, Salah ad-Din did not march alone. The world that shaped Salah ad-Din did not stop at his person. It extended into the lives of those he chose to surround himself with. These men, like him, emerged from the womb of the madrasa system, a world that prized knowledge, nurtured piety, and called men to serve not themselves, but something greater. They gave like he gave. They prayed like he prayed. They bled and wept and stood firm as he did. These were not men who chased the glint of worldly gold. They were scholars and scribes, warriors and administrators, whose hearts beat in rhythm with the pulpit and the prayer rug. Personally, if I could, I would make separate videos on each one of these men who blessed Salah ad-Din with their company. That's how important a role they played. When it comes to Salah ad-Din's dream team of emirs, politicians, bureaucrats, secretaries, and generals, there could not have been a more important person than Al-Qadi Al-Fadil. His rise through the ranks of power reads less like a biography and more like a masterclass in political survival. You could call it Machiavellian, and you'd be right. It's no stretch to say that it was Al-Qadi Al-Fadil who quietly delivered the Fatimid state into the hands of Shirkuh and Salah ad-Din. They called him Salah ad-Din's advisor, but in reality, he was much more than that, and some. Al-Qadi Al-Fadil didn't just advise Salah ad-Din, he was the state. Salah ad-Din acknowledged this when he claimed that Egypt was not conquered by his armies, but by the pen of Al-Qadi Al-Fadil. Salah ad-Din knew that Al-Qadi Al-Fadil was indispensable as an advisor as well as a faithful companion, which is why he kept him close by for 22 years and endowed him with incredible power across his kingdom. Other than Al-Qadi Al-Fadil, there are too many names to study deeply in this video. What made Salah ad-Din and his generation different was their background and their love for knowledge. A lot of his men were not only administrators, but scholars who taught in madrasas. What is remarkable is just how many people who served under Salah ad-Din studied under the great hadith master and Shafi'i jurist, Silafi in his madrasa, and Maliki jurist Ibn Auf. Salah ad-Din didn't rule alone. Around him stood a constellation of sharp minds and steady hands. Men like Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad and Imad-ud-Din al-Asfahani, who weren't just scribes with elegant pens, but anchors that kept him grounded. Oftentimes when Salah ad-Din flipped into grieving a loved one's death, illness, or a fit of rage from a usurping relative, there was somewhere in the room a wise advisor speaking truth and logic to the Sultan. This new breed of scholar administrator class was instrumental for Saladin's success. They helped Saladin hold Egypt, take Syria, and unlock Jerusalem. It was Egypt, not just its gold or grain, but its network of madrasas built by Saladin and his kin that stitched his sultanate back to the old Nizamiya blueprint of Baghdad. That connection was no accident. It was the spine of a revival. Here's what most people don't talk about when they talk about Saladin. His toughest battle was not Hattin. It wasn't liberating Jerusalem. It was keeping it. Keeping the city proved harder than winning it. The crown jewel of Jerusalem came with a hefty price, and oh, how Saladin paid. The remnants of the fractured Frank kingdom stubbornly persisted in the Levant. They regrouped fast, and that thorn in Saladin's back flared into a wildfire. And it wasn't just the Franks. His own relatives started carving out their own little kingdoms, eyeing his crown, eyeing each other. Betrayal was brewing from within while a storm gathered across the sea. One after another, kings and lords of Europe raised their banners and vowed vengeance. By the time October 1189 rolled around, close to 100,000 crusaders were marching. But there was only one Frank that conquered Saladin, King Richard of England. From the time King Richard landed on Levantine shores, the true test had begun for Saladin and his men. There was no greater military threat to the Sultan's success than the relentless attacks of Richard. By the time they met in battle, Saladin had been at war for 5 years straight. His coffers were bleeding, his men were worn thin, his resources hanged by a thread. From 1191 to 1192, the story of Saladin turned into something out of a tragedy. Clashes, retreats, losses piling up like storm clouds. And Richard, he fought like thunder. Fast, brutal, unrelenting. Every time Saladin struck, Richard struck harder. The Crusader army moved with frightening speed, answering each Muslim counterattack harder than the last. Saladin's heart sank, not just from the weight of the enemy bearing down, but from the silence behind him. Baghdad turned its back on him. The jealous caliph offered no aid. Even Saladin's own emirs, men who once swore loyalty, began slipping away, leaving the Sultan to fight on with fewer and fewer hands. Doctors became alarmed from the Sultan's deteriorating health. Going without food for great lengths of time, insisting on riding on horseback with his troops, urging, pleading, cajoling, and shaming his men forward. However, it was no use. Richard took Acre swiftly within 1 month of landing. 3,000 Muslim defenders were captured. Then came the ransom, 200,000 dinars for their release, with just 30 days to deliver. Saladin paid half, not out of frugality, but because something didn't feel right. He didn't trust Richard, and he was right not to. The negotiations dragged, confusions piled up, deadlines slipped past. Then came the horror. Richard lined up the prisoners, every last one of them, roped them together, arms bound, marched out into the sunlit plain like livestock. And then, with no mercy, he slaughtered them, all 3,000 by sundown. Upon hearing of the massacre, Saladin was moved to fury, and in the aftermath, he allowed his men to commit atrocities against Christian prisoners. But this was not his natural way, and just as quickly, he collected himself and ordered that no unjust blood should be spilled. But throughout the year, it was clear Saladin was showing signs of deterioration. Richard tested Saladin's cautious nature to its very limit. He attacked King Richard whenever he could with whatever he had, with no rhyme or reason, committing blunder after blunder. The bitter siege of attrition between the kings was raging with intensity, and it was quickly becoming clear that Richard was coming out on top. While Saladin stood strong defending Jerusalem, Richard would tease Saladin by threatening to march on Egypt to sabotage Saladin's money-generating capital. This caught Saladin in a dilemma. Go to Egypt and lose the Holy Land? Stay in Jerusalem and lose his war chest necessary for defending Jerusalem. He chose to stay in Jerusalem. This didn't deter King Richard, as he knew that given enough men, he could take Jerusalem easily. This greatly concerned Saladin, to the point where he was seen by Ibn Shaddad crying and pleading all night in prayer, invoking Allah for any support against Richard's first attack the next day. But then, nothing came. No Richard, no army, no crusaders, nothing. With the might of Saladin's intelligence network, he could not have predicted just how disunited the Crusaders were. The English could not agree with the French on how to attack Jerusalem, surprise surprise, and King Richard's reinforcements never came due to squabbling. Richard could not mobilize any army to Egypt or Jerusalem, and affairs in England nagged the king back to his home. By the grace of God, Jerusalem was saved by disunity amongst the Crusaders. That's how close Salah ad-Din came to losing all that he had worked for. King Richard left for England with a truce between he and Salah ad-Din, the contents of which allows for Christian pilgrims to enter the Holy Land to fulfill their religious rites with a clause. The English king wanted the French to be excluded from the truce agreement. No pilgrimage for the French. Salah ad-Din ignored Richard and allowed all who wished to visit to do so. In the end, while fortifying himself in Jerusalem, awaiting the final assault, Salah ad-Din had realized an achievement which was even greater than his victory in Hattin. That is, to have won Jerusalem was a considerable achievement. To have not lost it was an even greater one. After the dust of war had settled, the past few years had taken a terrible toll on the Sultan's health. He never performed the pilgrimage to Mecca, as time never allowed it. He returned to his beloved childhood home of Damascus in 1192, the first time since 1189. He became increasingly ill very rapidly. It became clear to everyone that he had reached the point of no return. Ibn Shaddad and Al-Qadi al-Fadil were in constant attendance to the dying king. Ibn Shaddad noted that even in tremendous pain, he showed great signs of humility to his servants when they accidentally faulted their care of him. Imam Abu Ja'far recited Quran beside Salah ad-Din while he fell in and out of consciousness. When the Imam recited the verse, "He is God, than whom there is no other God, who knows the unseen and the visible," a smile broke out on Salah ad-Din's face and he uttered, "It is true," before passing away, age 55. Salah ad-Din died penniless. He left behind 47 silver coins and a single gold coin. He didn't have enough money to pay for his funeral, not even enough to buy the straw with which his tomb was lined. It was Al-Qadi al-Fadil who covered the funeral costs. This was perhaps the final contradiction in a life full of contradictions. The most powerful man in the Islamic world, Salah ad-Din, effectively died penniless. He is most famous for the victory of Hattin, yet he was not a great general. King Richard proved this. The ruler of a vast empire, yet he was a poor administrator. Al-Qadi al-Fadil was essentially running the empire for him. He was a champion for Islamic orthodoxy, yet his theology was simple. When times called for a quick decisive decision, he erred on the side of slow deliberate caution. All these traits do not add up to being a great leader. But how come there is no dispute that he was a genius? How come both allies and enemies loved him, contemporary and later generations? When all legends and myths are stripped away, Salah ad-Din was a profoundly simple man, and therein lie his greatness. Do not be mistaken, he wasn't a simpleton. He would hardly have survived if that were the case. As a child, he was faithful and loyal. He understood that madrasas were essential to the continuation of orthodoxy, so he continued to build them more than anyone. He was a Shafi'i but did not alienate any other school of thought. He believed rescuing Jerusalem was his duty, so he made it his mission to push relentlessly, with resoluteness, to capture the city and stay there to defend it when everyone else abandoned him. He did not share Nur-ad-Din Zinki's austerity, but resembled the great leader in his aesthetic nature, which won many people to his side, since austerity rarely appeals to the masses. Unlike Nur-ad-Din's quiet, dignified courts, Salah ad-Din's were noisy, full of men not afraid to speak their mind, and were certainly not intimidated by him. In many ways, Salah ad-Din was an outsider, a Kurd amongst Turks, an Ayyubid at a time of Zengids. People wearied him with demands because they knew he would not turn them away empty-handed. The Franks were astonished with his generosity. No reasonable request was turned down, and once he gave his word, he never broke it. Salah ad-Din was no deep thinker, but what he believed in, he believed deeply with great sincerity. Sincerity. He found one act to do, believed it was true, and did it. That's it. So, now that we have gotten to know the great leader's life more intimately, we can now come back to the original question we asked at the beginning of this piece. Was Salah ad-Din great because he liberated Jerusalem, or was he able to liberate Jerusalem because he was great? I think it's pretty obvious what's the answer. Salah ad-Din was great, and so Allah chose him to liberate the sacred land of Jerusalem. But I want to ask another question now, to our modern audience. What are we waiting for? Are we not tired of the decades of humiliation, oppression and injustice? Do we not want to see change? Did not men like Nizam al-Mulk, Imam al-Ghazali, Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani and Nur-ad-Din al-Zinki work tirelessly to build a generation like that of Salah ad-Din to rise to the occasion? Do we not need to work the same and even more? Did Salah ad-Din just sit around and wait for scholars to work out their theological debates? Did he wait for Sunni Islam to agree to follow one madhab? Did he think that he can do this all by himself? Or did he work with capable men who oftentimes disagreed with him? Was he waiting to get his hand on the latest weapons technology and complain that he cannot do anything because of the flawed political system he operated in? I think we know the answers to these questions. If I can ask you to take on one learning from Salah ad-Din, it will be this. Find one good idea, or one good deed, or one good action, and take it seriously and sincerely. Allah will work out the rest. May Allah have mercy on Salah ad-Din's soul.